If you're clicking on this video, there's a decent chance you've seen this tweet right here before. It's a kind of oversimplified way of explaining something that you're probably more than familiar with if you've followed the indie horror gaming scene as of late. These co-op-centric games whose art styles try to catch a blend of silly and scary that have you going out on missions to get cash to fill quotas, buy equipment, and so on. Not to brag or anything, but I caught on to this trend back in April of 2024, a little after Content Warning released on Steam. I was on this subgenre before R.E.P.O came out, and if you saw my video about subgenres, you know I'm critical of indie game fans being hostile towards the formation of them, largely due to people who make oversimplifications like the whole Earthbound-inspired indie RPG with a depressed protagonist, quote-unquote subgenre, or in this case, Friendslop. When I wrote about the subgenre back in April 2024, I called it co-op investigative horror, but that name is a mouthful, so let's just call it Friendslop for simplicity, even if I think calling it slop is mean. I mean, it's much better than calling these company likes or lethal likes. And to be clear, this tweet is totally a joke. Like, nobody would use the term friend farming unironically, but there's truth in jest. So let's mess around with this idea a little. Is Friendslop a problem? Before I get into this, I'll say that I've only personally played Lethal Company, Phasmophobia, and Content Warning. I never gave R.E.P.O a shot, I haven't played Murky Divers, The Headliners, or any other game that's going to pop up in the background of this video, other than the three that I've mentioned. So do keep that in mind. When I wrote about the subgenre, I categorized games into it by a few oddly specific criteria. Namely, these were co-op horror games with some type of monetary incentive to engage with the creatures, some semblance of roguelike elements often being thrown in to add tension, like losing items when you die, or potentially losing entire runs on a failure to meet a quota. And their humor was often partially derived from intentionally quirky jank. These games are often a little unstable and go crazy with the ragdoll physics, but that's all intentional. At least partially. Even the concept of these games is a little funny, since you're throwing yourself at these terrifying creatures just to make a quick buck. It's kind of part of the humor. Hell, it's what inspired the subheading for my article when I wrote about it. I also know one or two friends of mine will get annoyed that I called it roguelike elements, so I'll say that many of these games are arcade-esque, what with everything resetting when you do finally lose. However, the focus of that article was on how each of the three games I had played built more and more on the foundation. Phasmophobia was sort of an intro to the genre, Lethal Company established many of its mainstays, and Content Warning iterated on the base that Lethal Company set. I also pointed out how these games all incentivize you to interact with the monster behind traditional horror game progress. In Phasmophobia, sometimes you have to talk to the ghost or watch its behavior to really solidify what ghost type it is. Lethal Company requires you enter the facility to meet quotas via selling the scrap you find, and Content Warning actively requires you to record the monsters you encounter in order to meet view quotas. Seriously, this game is just how it feels to be a YouTuber. You wanna know why I never upload? This shit is why. Regardless, I kinda want to expand on the idea of iteration a little bit. There's a concern that these games are all just kind of carbon copies of each other, or at least copies of Lethal Company. The timing here is not coincidental. Lethal Company exploded in popularity, a bunch of other games with similar ideas pop up and fight for scraps when people want something similar, but not quite the same. But were these games made to make a quick buck, or were they made out of genuine admiration? There's a question of imitation versus inspiration, and if you want a third term to throw in there, iteration is a big one here. As I mentioned, Content Warning felt more like an expansion on some of the ideas present in Lethal Company. The gameplay loop was largely the same, but what you did in the old world was fairly different since it forced you to engage monsters more directly, whereas in Lethal Company, there are very few issues that cannot be solved with a swift exit, outside of crippling debt, I suppose. I do understand why people feel fatigued on this concept. Just at the start of writing this video, I already have 6 games I would classify as part of this subgenre, and it feels like more and more have popped up over time. And I know I'm forgetting a few that I've seen. We haven't seen the last of this subgenre. The main question I want to answer is whether this iteration is a problem or not. These games are using similar bases, and while there are differences in their mechanics, the core loop and appeal is relatively the same. They have different art styles, but as I said before, they're all trying to blend the silly with the spooky. Are these games inspired, or are they cash grabs? I'm sure that the answer varies between games, some may be more genuine than others, but that's not really my place to speculate on. In the wake of companies like Game Freak attempting to copyright game mechanics, I think the discussion of what crosses the line of inspiration into imitation is important, but the simple answer is it can't really be defined. Even in cases where someone attempts to recreate a game as close to one-to-one as possible in another engine or system, that still has that spark of creativity to me. since it's often inexperienced creators trying to make something from an inspiration as opposed to making a quick cash grab. Even the most derivative of the examples of this subgenre don't feel like corporate plants. They all have something to sell them as unique and have their fair share of charm. It's mostly indie devs making these. My tone might have been different if it was larger studios making money off of the concept of indie devs though. Going back to the points I made in the first video on my channel, I feel like I'm seeing a pattern repeat again. People resenting an emerging subgenre and oversimplifying their comparisons, which inevitably causes people within those fandoms to feel at odds with each other. When the game you like gets called a shameless Lethal Company clone, explaining the differences in mechanics or expansions on certain systems or the subtle differences in art style tends to fall on deaf ears because from an outside lens, people see them as mostly the same. Admittedly, I'm somewhat guilty of this. In my new Standards of Genres video, I talked about the danger of letting a single game define its genre to the point of each game feeling like an imitation of that example. And even earlier in the script, I said that Lethal Company feels like something of a base for a lot of these games just because it was the most popular one. I did also mention that oversimplification of comparisons, though, is the primary issue. That video was more meant to target the cause, whereas now I'm talking more about the effect. I think it's fine that we're seeing so many of these games emerge right now because it's a budding subgenre. Games that are more or less just the base with a new mechanic or idea aren't as egregious to me because I don't think they all need to reinvent the wheel. People who liked one or two of these games will probably like more. It's natural for us to crave more of what we enjoy. And I never think getting more games in this subgenre or any subgenre is bad. I know most people share this stance, but the conversation always seems to favor those negative voices who get annoyed when they see similarities in games they ultimately don't care about or even play in most cases. It's the holy shit, 2 cakes meme all over again. Call it baseless speculation, but I think a lot of this anxiety is due to the mascot horror trend. When subgenres get popular enough, they tend to overshadow the genre at large. Ever since FNAF went free roam, mascot horror games, including FNAF itself, have felt more alike from a viewer and even player perspective. People were saying Secret of the Mimic felt like Poppy Playtime, which people smack-talked for just riding on the popularity of mascot horror games like FNAF. We've gone full circle. I definitely think horror game fans in general may have some worries about the genre at large, but the way I see game development, new games existing doesn't cancel out the existence of others. It's not like we would have gotten more survival horror-esque games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill if Friendslop or mascot horror didn't take off. At least in my view, since they occupy different subgenres of horror, really calling horror a genre in gaming feels a little off since it has nothing to do with mechanics. There's survival horror, which itself feels like more of a wider genre than anything specific. Really calling something a horror game is more about tone and, well, horror than mechanics. I've talked about the whole niche argument before, but to summarize, I also think fans of games, especially indie games, are often obsessed with keeping their small fanbase as feeling small, and preventing their interest from hitting the mainstream. You can make an argument this applies to all forms of entertainment or pop culture though, and I won't disagree. However, I think the bigger issue here is that a lot of people are eager to question what a game's purpose is, as if to say that a piece of art needs to have a purpose. Basically, if its audience is a near 100% match with an existing game, then why bother? My response to this might be a little strange, but as someone who makes art in my own stupid way, I'm inclined towards the argument of just letting people make art. Like, so what if it's extremely close to their inspiration? If they like making it and people like consuming it and the art is harmless, then I don't see throwing a fit over its existence. In fact, this is why I said in my announcement video that I'm not super proud of the Standards and Genres video. It wasn't my intent, but that video can kind of be read as me complaining about even indie games being too derivative, something that I'm defending now. But I've grown as a person. Probably. I don't know. And my point about not sacrificing what made your work unique still stands, I think. In any case, is Friendslop a problem? No, I don't think so. At least not yet. Only time will really tell if this has lasting consequences on the indie sphere, or even AAA gaming. I'm more concerned with letting people make art and seeing where they go with their take on the subgenre. And I hope the success of this subgenre can help drive interest in subgenres in general. I'm a fan of roguelikes, I see this kind of thing happen all the time. In case you haven't noticed, I just really like talking about subgenres, and this will not be the last time I do so. And maybe, just maybe, we'll stop seeing people use slop to refer to subgenres. Nah, who am I kidding? This is internet discourse. The most inflammatory way of wording something is always going to get the most traction. So, if you watched this whole thing and didn't subscribe to my channel, gods, I can't even bring myself to be mean. Just end the video.